The unexpected encounter. Nathan exhaled as he pulled into his driveway, exhaustion sinking deep into his bones. His shift at the hardware store had been longer than usual, and every muscle in his body ached from lifting, bending, and assisting customers all day. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 6:47 p.m. Late, but not late enough to avoid the nightly routine with his daughter, Lily. All he wanted to do was heat up the leftover pasta from the night before, sink into the couch, and spend a little time with Lily before tucking her into bed. But as he stepped out of his old sit-in, his gaze fell on the moving truck parked across the street. Stacks of boxes sat on the curb, and a frail-looking elderly man was struggling to lift one off the truck's ramp. Nathan sighed, rolling his shoulders. His back throbbed, his feet were sore, and the last thing he wanted to do was play the Good Samaritan. But he couldn't just stand there and watch the man hurt himself. From the back seat, Lily unbuckled her seatbelt and hopped out of the car. Her bright hazel eyes followed her father's line of sight. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. "Nothing, sweetheart," Nathan replied, forcing a small smile. "Go inside and wash up. I'll be right there." Lily nodded, her tiny backpack bouncing as she ran toward the house. Nathan hesitated for a second before taking a deep breath and crossing the street. "Need a hand?" he called out. The elderly man turned around, clearly caught off guard. He looked to be in his late 70s, with thinning white hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and kind, sharp blue eyes. He wore a button-up shirt tucked into a pair of well-worn slacks, his frame lean but sturdy. "Oh, I wouldn't want to trouble you, son," the man said, though the way he was struggling with the box told a different story. "It's no trouble," Nathan said, already reaching for the box. He immediately regretted it. The thing was heavier than he expected. "What do you have in here, Perbix?" The old man chuckled. "Books, a lifetime's worth of them." Nathan grunted as he carried the box inside. The house was mostly empty, save for a few pieces of furniture that had already been placed. It had a cozy, old-fashioned charm, but it felt like someone who had spent years somewhere else and was now starting over. "I'm Nathan, by the way," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Edward," the man replied, offering a firm handshake. Nathan was surprised by the strength in his grip. "You moving in alone?" Nathan asked, glancing around. Edward nodded. "Just me. My wife passed a few years ago. Figured it was time for a change of scenery." Nathan's eyes flicked back to the moving truck, still half full. "You got anyone helping you unload this?" Edward chuckled. "Well, I hired some movers, but they left early. Guess they figured an old man could handle the rest." Nathan frowned. That didn't sit right with him. He glanced at his house, knowing Lily was waiting for him, and his stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since noon. But Edward was alone, and clearly he needed help. Nathan exhaled sharply. "All right, let's get this done." Edward looked surprised. "Oh, you don't have to." "I know," Nathan interrupted, "but I will." For the next hour, Nathan hauled box after box into the house, following Edward's instructions. Some were filled with books, others with vinyl records, old photo albums, and kitchenware. The man had quite the collection, but it was clear that most of it held sentimental value. Edward tried to help, but Nathan waved him off. "I got this. You just tell me where to put everything." As they worked, they talked. Edward spoke about his wife, Margaret, and how they had lived in the same house for nearly 50 years before he decided to move. He didn't go into details, but Nathan could tell the loss still weighed heavily on him. In turn, Nathan shared a little about himself, how he was raising Lily on his own after his wife walked out on them 2 years ago. How money was tight, but he was doing his best to make sure Lily had everything she needed. Edward listened carefully, nodding every now and then. He didn't offer advice or pity, just quiet understanding. By the time they were done, Nathan was drenched in sweat, his arms weak from all the lifting. "That's the last of them," he said, collapsing onto the couch that Edward had just managed to push into place. Edward sat down beside him with a tired sigh. I don't know how to thank you, son. Nathan waved a hand. Don't worry about it. Just glad I could help. Edward studied him for a long moment. Not many people would go out of their way like that. Nathan shrugged. Guess I was raised that way. Edward chuckled. Your parents must have been good people. Nathan smiled faintly. Yeah, they were. He glanced at the clock and winced. I should get going. My daughter's probably wondering where I am. Edward nodded. Of course. But listen, Nathan, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock on my door. Nathan appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't the type to ask for help. He had spent the last 2 years figuring things out on his own, and he wasn't about to start relying on anyone now. Still, he nodded. I'll keep that in mind. As he walked back to his house, exhaustion settled deep in his bones. He was starving, sore, and ready to collapse. But when he stepped inside and saw Lily sitting at the kitchen table, her little face lighting up as she saw him, he knew he had made the right choice. Daddy, you took forever, she pouted. Nathan chuckled, ruffling her hair. I was helping our new neighbor move in. Lily's eyes widened. Is he nice? Nathan smiled as he sat down beside her. Yeah, sweetheart. I think he is. Little did he know, Edward wasn't just any old man. And soon, Nathan's life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. A new beginning. Nathan woke up the next morning with a deep, aching soreness in his muscles. Lifting all those heavy boxes for Edward the previous evening had taken more of a toll on his body than he expected. As he sat up in bed, he stretched his arms, wincing as his back protested. He had been working at the hardware store for years, but it had been a while since he had exerted himself like that. He glanced at the clock. 5:45 a.m. Too early to be awake, but his body was already alert, conditioned to his morning routine. With a groan, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and got up. In the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as he poured himself a cup. The warmth spread through his fingers as he took a slow sip, enjoying the brief moment of peace before the day officially began. Daddy, why are you up so early? Lily's small voice startled him. She stood at the entrance of the kitchen, still in her pink pajamas, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Nathan smiled and set his mug down. Just habit, sweetheart. Why are you up? She shrugged, padding over to the table and climbing onto a chair. I smelled coffee. Nathan chuckled, ruffling her messy hair as he sat down beside her. You don't even like coffee. I like the smell, she said matter-of-factly, swinging her legs. Are you still tired from helping Mr. Edward? A little, Nathan admitted. But it was worth it. Sometimes people just need a little help. Lily nodded, as if storing the lesson away in her young mind. I like Mr. Edward. He looks like a grandpa in the movies. Nathan smiled. Yeah, he kind of does. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Nathan frowned, glancing at the clock again. 6:10 a.m. Who could possibly be knocking this early? Stay here, he told Lily as he got up and walked to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Edward standing on the porch, holding a small brown paper bag. He looked a bit more put together than the previous night. His white hair was combed, and he wore a clean sweater over his slacks. Morning, son, Edward greeted with a small smile. Hope I'm not waking you. Nathan shook his head. Not at all. Come on in. Edward stepped inside, glancing around the modest but tidy home. I wanted to bring you something. Just a little thank you for all your help last night. He handed Nathan the paper bag, and when Nathan peeked inside, he saw a neatly wrapped breakfast sandwich and a small thermos of what smelled like coffee. You didn't have to do this, Nathan said, surprised. Edward waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense. A good meal starts the day off right. Nathan felt an unexpected warmth spread through him. It had been a long time since someone had done something thoughtful for him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Would you like to sit for a bit?" Edward nodded, and they walked into the kitchen, where Lily was still seated at the table, kicking her feet. "Good morning, young lady," Edward greeted warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she chirped. Edward smiled. "Call me Edward. Mister makes me feel too old." Lily giggled. "Okay, Edward." Nathan set the bag on the table and gestured to a chair. "Can I get you some coffee?" Edward patted the thermos. "Already brought my own. But I wouldn't say no to a little company." As Nathan sat back down, Edward took a sip from his thermos, his eyes scanning the room. "This is a nice place you've got here. Cozy." Nathan shrugged. "It's not much, but it's home." Edward nodded. "That's what matters. A home isn't about how fancy it is. It's about the people in it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Edward spoke again. "You mentioned last night that you've been raising Lily on your own." Nathan stiffened slightly. He wasn't used to talking about his personal life. "Yeah. Her mother left a couple of years ago. Haven't heard from her since." Edward's expression softened. "I'm sorry, son. That's a heavy burden to carry." Nathan forced a small smile. "It is what it is. I do my best." Edward studied him for a long moment. "I admire that." Nathan wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded. Lily, completely unaware of the heaviness of the conversation, suddenly piped up. "Edward, do you have any kids?" Edward's expression flickered for a second before he smiled gently. "No, sweetheart. Just me and Margaret, my wife. We never had children." "Why not?" Lily asked innocently. Nathan was about to tell her to drop it, but Edward didn't seem to mind. He took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Life just didn't work out that way for us," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something Nathan couldn't quite place. "But I've met plenty of wonderful kids over the years, and now I get to have you as a new neighbor, which is just as nice." Lily beamed. "You're our neighbor and our friend." Edward chuckled. "That's right." Nathan found himself smiling. It was strange. He had only met Edward the night before, but there was something about him that felt familiar, comfortable, like an old friend he hadn't realized he was missing. After finishing their breakfast, Edward stood and stretched. "Well, I won't take up any more of your morning. Just wanted to drop that off and say thanks again." Nathan walked him to the door. "You didn't have to do that, but I really appreciate it." Edward met his gaze. "Sometimes people just need a little help. You did it for me, and I'll do it for you." Nathan felt his throat tighten slightly at the simple but powerful words. He wasn't used to leaning on others, but Edward made it feel okay. "See you around, Edward. See you around, son." As Nathan closed the door and turned back to Lily, she grinned. "I like Edward." Nathan chuckled. "Yeah, me too." Little did he know, their friendship was just beginning. And soon, Edward would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. An offer too good to be true. The following days passed quickly, but something about them felt different. Lighter, maybe. Nathan wasn't sure if it was Edward's unexpected kindness or the way Lily had taken such a liking to him. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel as alone. He still went through the same routines. Early mornings, long shifts at the hardware store, picking up Lily from school, making dinner, paying bills. But the weight of it all didn't press down on him quite as hard. And then, on a Thursday evening, everything changed. Nathan had just picked up Lily from school when he spotted Edward sitting on his front porch, a newspaper in one hand, a steaming cup of tea in the other. It had become something of a ritual. Edward always seemed to be outside around this time, and Nathan had gotten used to waving as he pulled into the driveway. But today was different. Instead of waving back, Edward set his cup down and stood up as Nathan stepped out of the car. "Got a minute, son?" Edward called. Nathan glanced at Lily, who was humming a tune as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "Go inside and wash up. "Sweetheart, I'll be right there." Lily gave a small nod and ran toward the house, her backpack bouncing against her back. Nathan shut the car door and walked across the street. Edward gestured to one of the chairs on his porch. "Have a seat." Nathan frowned slightly but did as he was asked. He could tell from the way Edward was watching him that this wasn't just a casual chat. There was something behind those sharp blue eyes, something serious. "You work at the hardware store, right?" Edward asked. Nathan nodded. "Yeah, been there for years." "Do you like it?" The question caught Nathan off guard. "I mean, it's a job. It pays the bills. Keeps a roof over Lily's head." Edward took a slow sip of his tea. "That's not what I asked." Nathan let out a breath, leaning back in his chair. "It's not about what I like, Edward. It's about stability. I've got Lily to take care of. I can't afford to take risks." Edward nodded as if he expected that answer. "And what if I told you that stability could come from somewhere better? Somewhere that pays more? With benefits?" Nathan tensed. "What are you talking about?" Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Nathan, who hesitated before taking it. "What's this?" Nathan asked, his brow furrowing. "An opportunity," Edward said simply. Nathan opened the envelope, unfolding the paper inside. His eyes scanned the neatly typed words, his breath catching as he read. It was a job offer. Not just any job, one that paid nearly double what he was making now. A position at a well-established contracting company. One that came with health insurance, paid time off, and actual stability. Nathan's hands tightened around the paper as he looked up. "I don't understand." Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know the owner. He's an old friend of mine. Told him about you, about your work ethic, about how you helped me without expecting anything in return. He's willing to give you a shot." Nathan swallowed hard. "But I never asked for this." Edward smiled faintly. "I know. That's what makes you the right person for it." Nathan felt his chest tighten. This was too much, too good to be true. "I don't even know anything about contracting," he admitted. Edward chuckled. "You've been working at a hardware store for years. You know tools, you know materials, and you know hard work. The rest, you can learn. And if you're worried about training, don't be. They'll teach you." Nathan shook his head, his mind racing. "I can't just walk away from my job. What if? What if it actually works out?" Edward interrupted. Nathan fell silent. "You've spent years scraping by, son," Edward continued, his voice calm but firm. "This is your chance to break that cycle, to give Lily something better." Nathan's fingers clenched around the letter. He had spent so long doing things the hard way, surviving on his own, refusing to ask for help. And now, here was Edward, offering him something that could change everything. "But why?" Nathan finally asked. "Why are you doing this for me?" Edward's expression softened. "Because I've been where you are. And because someone once did the same for me." Nathan didn't know what to say. For years, he had been waiting for something, anything, that would make life a little easier. And now that it was right in front of him, he was afraid to take it. Edward seemed to sense the hesitation in his silence. "Just think about it," he said. "You don't have to decide right now. But don't let fear be the thing that holds you back." Nathan nodded slowly, folding the letter and tucking it into his pocket. "I'll think about it." Edward smiled. "That's all I ask." That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Nathan sat at the kitchen table, the job offer spread out in front of him. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This could change everything. More money, better hours, a future that didn't feel like an endless cycle of barely making ends meet. But could he take the risk? He had spent years in survival mode, always doing what was safest, what was most secure. Taking this job meant stepping into the unknown. And yet, he thought about Lily, about the future she deserved, about how tired he was of constantly worrying, constantly counting every dollar. Maybe it was time to do something different. Maybe it was time to take a chance. With a steadying breath, Nathan reached for his phone and dialed the number on the letter. A deep voice answered on the other end. Richard speaking. Nathan swallowed. Hi. My name is Nathan Carter. Edward sent me. There was a brief pause before Richard responded. I was wondering when you'd call. You free for an interview tomorrow? Nathan closed his eyes for a moment, his heart pounding. Yeah, he said. I'm free. Good, Richard said. See you at noon. As Nathan hung up, he let out a shaky breath. This was it. A new beginning. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. Walking into the unknown. Nathan had barely slept the night before. Even after he hung up the phone with Richard, his thoughts had refused to quiet down. He had spent so long holding on to the familiar, to the job at the hardware store, to the routine that kept his life predictable, albeit difficult. Now he was standing on the edge of something entirely new, and the weight of it pressed against his chest like an unseen force. What if he wasn't good enough? What if it didn't work out? What if he was making a mistake? The sun had barely risen when he got out of bed, the early morning silence thick around him. He went through the motions of his routine, showering, getting dressed, making coffee, all while the nerves in his stomach twisted and turned. By the time Lily padded into the kitchen, still rubbing the sleep from her eyes, Nathan had already downed 2 cups of coffee. She climbed onto a chair, blinking up at him. Daddy, why are you up so early? Nathan smiled, but it felt a little forced. Got a big day ahead, sweetheart. She tilted her head. Because of the new job. He exhaled. Yeah. Lily considered this for a moment before breaking into a bright smile. I think you're gonna be amazing. Nathan chuckled despite himself, reaching over to ruffle her hair. Think so, huh? She nodded enthusiastically. Yep. And Edward thinks so too. That means it's true. The simplicity of her belief in him hit harder than he expected. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was exactly what he needed to do. The interview. At exactly 11:45 a.m., Nathan pulled into the parking lot of Harrison & Co. Contracting. The building was bigger than he expected, a 2-story structure with large windows and a logo that looked like it had been there for decades. He gripped the steering wheel, his nerves spiking again. He hadn't done a real job interview in years. He had started working at the hardware store straight out of high school and never really left. Could he do this? A sharp knock on his window startled him. Nathan turned to see Richard Harrison standing outside the car, arms crossed, watching him with a knowing expression. The man was in his late 50s, built solid, with silver streaks in his short-cropped hair. Nathan quickly stepped out of the car, clearing his throat. Sorry, he said. Just gathering my thoughts. Richard smirked. I get it. First big step's always the hardest. He gestured toward the building. Come on in. Nathan followed him inside, surprised by how busy the place was. Workers moved back and forth, discussing blueprints, loading supplies, and making phone calls. The place buzzed with energy. Richard led him into a small office and gestured for him to sit. So, Richard began, leaning back in his chair. Edward speaks highly of you. Nathan exhaled, feeling the weight of that statement. I didn't ask him to, he admitted. Richard nodded, clearly expecting that answer. That's why I trust it. Nathan blinked. I've known Edward for over 30 years, Richard continued. Back when we were just a couple of guys trying to build something from nothing. He doesn't vouch for people lightly. So if he says you're worth my time, I believe him. Nathan swallowed. I appreciate that. Richard studied him. You've been working at a hardware store for what? 10 years. 12, Nathan corrected. Ever work with tools? Repairs? Nathan nodded. A little. I've done some handyman jobs here and there. Fixed things around the house when they broke. I know my way around materials, what works and what doesn't. Richard seemed to think about that for a moment. You ever done contracting work? Nathan hesitated. Not officially. Richard leaned forward. So let me ask you this. Why do you want this job? Nathan's throat felt dry. This was it, the part where he had to prove himself. He took a breath. I spent the last few years just surviving, he admitted. Working shifts, paying bills, raising my daughter the best I can. But I want more than that. I want to actually build something. A real future. And I know I can work hard. I just need a chance. Richard was silent for a long moment, his sharp eyes assessing Nathan. Then he smirked. I like that answer. Nathan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. All right, Richard said, pushing a folder toward him. You start Monday. Nathan blinked. Just like that. Richard chuckled. You think I don't know hard workers when I see 'em? You'll start as an apprentice, learning on site, getting trained on real projects. You keep up. You move up. Simple as that. Nathan stared at the paperwork, his heart pounding. This was real. This was happening. Welcome to the team, Richard said, extending a hand. Nathan shook it, gripping it firmly. Thank you, he said, his voice steady. Don't thank me, Richard said. Thank Edward. A debt he couldn't repay. That evening, Nathan stood on Edward's porch, hands shoved in his pockets. The older man opened the door with his usual calm expression. Well, Nathan exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. I got the job. Edward's lips twitched in a knowing smile. I figured you would. Nathan ran a hand through his hair. I don't even know how to thank you. Edward studied him. You ever wonder why I helped you? Nathan frowned. Because you're a good man. Edward chuckled. That's flattering, son, but that's not the reason. He turned and walked into the house, motioning for Nathan to follow. Nathan stepped inside, glancing around. The house was still mostly bare, filled only with a lifetime's worth of books and carefully placed furniture. Edward walked over to a shelf and picked up an old photograph, holding it out. Nathan took it and stared. It was Edward and Richard, much younger, standing in front of a half-built house, shaking hands. You built the company with him, Nathan murmured. Edward nodded. We started from nothing. I walked away when Margaret got sick, but I still have a say in things. Nathan looked up. So, you didn't just recommend me. You made sure I got the job. Edward met his gaze. You reminded me of myself years ago, a man doing everything he can for his family, even when no one's watching. Nathan's throat tightened. I don't know how to repay you. Edward smiled. You already did. Nathan frowned. How? Edward patted his shoulder. You helped an old man unload his boxes. Nathan swallowed hard. It had been such a simple thing, something he hadn't even thought twice about. But that moment had changed everything. Edward handed him a final envelope. One last thing. Nathan opened it, and his breath caught. A check. $10,000. Nathan's head snapped up. Edward. Edward held up a hand. Before you refuse, just know this. Someone did the same for me once, and when they did, I promised that one day I'd do the same for someone else. Nathan's hands shook slightly. This wasn't just help. It was a new beginning. Edward smiled. Now go take care of that little girl of yours. Nathan nodded, his throat tight. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was starting over. A new beginning comes with fear. Nathan sat on his porch long after leaving Edward's house, the envelope still gripped in his hands. The weight of the check inside felt unreal, almost like a cruel trick the universe was playing on him. He had spent years counting every dollar, stretching paychecks, and barely making ends meet. Now, in the span of a single week, everything had changed. But change was terrifying. A part of him wanted to rip up the check and walk away from the job, to stick with what he knew, no matter how difficult it was. Because what if he failed? What if this job turned out to be something he couldn't handle? What if he disappointed Edward? What if he wasn't as strong as people thought he was? He exhaled sharply, pressing his palms against his face. The fear of failure was suffocating, but the alternative, staying where he was, struggling to keep Lily's life together, was even worse. The door behind him creaked open. "Daddy." Lily's small voice drifted into the night air. Nathan straightened, forcing a smile as he turned to her. "Hey, sweetheart. Shouldn't you be in bed?" She stepped outside, her bare feet padding softly against the wood. "I saw the light on. And you weren't inside." She climbed onto the porch swing beside him, her little legs barely reaching the edge. "Are you sad?" Nathan swallowed. He never wanted her to see his worry, to feel the stress he carried every single day. But Lily was sharper than most kids her age. She saw more than he wanted her to. "No, baby," he said softly. "Just thinking." She leaned her head against his arm. "About the new job?" He hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice so small but filled with certainty, she whispered, "Are you scared?" Nathan stiffened. Of course he was, but how could he tell her that? He was supposed to be the strong one, the one who made sure their world was safe and stable. But maybe, just maybe, she deserved to know the truth. "A little," he admitted. Lily sat up straighter, frowning. "But why? You're the bravest person I know." Nathan chuckled, though it came out shakier than he intended. "I don't always feel very brave, sweetheart." She thought about that for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a great realization. "But you're still gonna do it, right?" He looked down at her big innocent eyes, filled with so much trust in him. Trust that he didn't want to break. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm still gonna do it." She beamed, satisfied with his answer. "Then I think you are brave." Nathan felt his chest tighten as he pulled her into a hug, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, kiddo." "I love you too, Daddy." For the first time that night, Nathan let go of his doubt. He was scared, but he wasn't doing this just for himself. He was doing it for her. His final day at the hardware store, Nathan walked into Henderson's Hardware the next morning with a strange mix of emotions: relief, anxiety, and something that felt almost like guilt. He had worked here for 12 years. It had become a second home, a place where he knew every aisle, every product, every regular customer. Leaving it behind felt unnatural, but it was necessary. His manager, Greg, was behind the counter, counting through some receipts when Nathan approached. "Hey, man," Greg greeted without looking up. "You're here early. Need extra hours?" Nathan exhaled. This part was going to be tough. Greg wasn't just his boss. He was a friend. "Actually, I need to talk to you." Greg glanced up, immediately picking up on the serious tone in Nathan's voice. He set the papers aside and leaned against the counter. "What's going on?" Nathan rubbed the back of his neck. "I got a job offer. A really good one." Greg's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't say anything. "I'm putting in my notice," Nathan continued. "I'll work the rest of the week if you need me to, but Monday, I'll be moving on." Greg let out a long whistle, crossing his arms. "Damn." He studied Nathan for a long moment. "I won't lie, man. That sucks for me. But it's good for you." Nathan felt his throat tighten. He had expected Greg to be upset, maybe even disappointed. But the look in his eyes was nothing but pride. "You've been busting your ass in this place for too long," Greg continued. "You deserve something better." Nathan nodded, the lump in his throat growing. "Thanks, Greg." Greg smirked. "You don't gotta thank me. Just don't screw it up." Nathan chuckled. "I'll try not to." Edward's warning. That afternoon, Nathan stopped by Edward's house. He hadn't planned to, but something about the day felt incomplete without talking to him. Edward was in his front yard, tending to a small flower bed when Nathan approached. "Afternoon, son," Edward said without looking up. That the face of a man who just quit his job. Nathan let out a breathy laugh. "Yeah, I guess it is." Edward wiped the dirt from his hands and stood. "Feels weird, doesn't it? Walking away from something you've known for so long." Nathan nodded. "Yeah, it really does." Edward studied him, as if searching for something. Then his voice turned serious. "There's something you need to know before Monday." Nathan frowned. "What is it?" Edward's gaze hardened, his usually kind expression turning firm. "Richard's a good man, but he doesn't hand things out for free. You're going to have to prove yourself. Fast." Nathan swallowed. "I figured." "You're going to work harder than you ever have before," Edward continued. "You're going to mess up. You're going to feel like quitting. And there will be days when you question why you took this job in the first place." Nathan felt his chest tighten. "So what do I do?" Edward's sharp blue eyes met his. "You don't quit." Nathan exhaled slowly. Edward rested a hand on his shoulder. "You've been surviving for too long, Nathan. Now it's time to build something. You've got the tools, you've got the heart, but the real question is, do you have the fight?" Nathan held his gaze. He thought about Lily, about the years he had spent scraping by, about how tired he was of just getting through each day instead of truly living. He was scared, but he wasn't going to let fear win. Nathan squared his shoulders. "I've got the fight." Edward smiled, giving his shoulder a firm pat. "Good. Then you'll do just fine." Nathan nodded, more determined than ever. Come Monday, his real journey would begin. And this time, he wouldn't fail. The first day of the rest of his life. A new world. Monday morning arrived too soon. Nathan barely had time to register the weekend before he found himself standing outside the Harrison & Co. contracting office, gripping a toolbox Edward had gifted him the night before. He had spent years walking into the hardware store, knowing exactly what his day would look like. Now he was walking into the unknown. A new job, a new career, a new life, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just working to survive. He was building something real. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The front office was bustling with movement, men in work boots and hard hats, a receptionist answering multiple phone calls at once, stacks of blueprints and order forms piled high on a desk near the back. Carter. Nathan turned at the sound of his last name and saw Richard Harrison standing near the hallway, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. "You're early." Nathan nodded. Didn't want to start off on the wrong foot. Richard smirked. "Good. Follow me." Nathan followed him through the hallway, passing several rooms filled with equipment, supply lists, and blueprints tacked to the walls. Finally, they stepped outside, where a massive workset stretched in front of them. Half-built houses, stacks of lumber, trucks filled with cement. Dozens of workers moving with purpose, lifting materials, measuring walls, pouring foundations. Nathan's stomach twisted. This was real work, not just ringing up items or giving people advice on what tool to buy. Richard stopped and turned to him. "This is where you're gonna be spending your days. You ready?" Nathan wanted to say yes, but the truth was, he wasn't sure. And Richard saw it. "Listen," Richard said, voice even. "Edward may have gotten you in the door, but he's not gonna do the work for you. You sink or swim on your own. Got it?" Nathan nodded. "Got it." Richard gestured to a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dust-covered work shirt, standing near a stack of wood. "Carter, meet Mason, your crew lead. You do what he says, when he says it, and we won't have any problems." Nathan extended a hand. "Nice to meet you." Mason glanced at his hand, then back at Richard. "This the new guy?" Richard nodded. "He's yours." Mason sighed. shaking his head. Great. Another rookie. Nathan lowered his hand as Mason turned toward him. You ever done anything like this before? Nathan straightened his posture. No, but I. Then don't act like you know what you're doing, Mason interrupted. You listen. You work. And you don't slow us down. Got it? Nathan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Got it. Mason pointed to a stack of wooden planks. Then grab those and follow me. Nathan did as he was told, hefting the weight of the materials onto his shoulder. The wood was heavier than expected, the pressure biting into his muscles almost immediately. Mason didn't slow down. He led Nathan across the worksite, where other men were already setting up the framework of a new house. Hammers pounded. Sawdust filled the air. The entire site felt like a well-oiled machine, and Nathan was the new, untested part. And he had a feeling Mason wasn't going to go easy on him. Breaking point. The first few hours were brutal. Mason had Nathan lifting, measuring, carrying, and hammering nonstop. Every muscle in his body burned. His hands were already developing blisters from gripping tools he hadn't used before. By noon, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his arms felt like lead. The other workers barely acknowledged him. They were too busy to care whether the new guy was keeping up or not. Nathan had never worked this hard in his life. Not even on the worst days at the hardware store. By lunchtime, he could barely move his fingers. He slumped against a stack of drywall, trying to catch his breath, when Mason walked over and tossed him a bottle of water. Nathan barely caught it before it hit his chest. You're slowing down, Mason said, arms crossed. Nathan gritted his teeth. He swallowed, his throat dry. I'm keeping up. Mason scoffed. Barely. And it's only noon. Nathan didn't say anything. He was too tired to argue. Mason studied him for a long moment before leaning forward slightly. You thinking about quitting yet? Nathan clenched his jaw. No. Mason smirked. Good. Then he walked away. The fight to keep going. By the time 5:00 p.m. rolled around, Nathan was spent. His body ached, his shirt was stained with dirt and sweat, and his blisters had turned into raw, red patches on his palms. He wanted to collapse, but as he wiped the sweat from his forehead, he saw something across the worksite that made his chest tighten. Edward. The old man was standing near the office, watching. Not interfering. Not stepping in. Just watching. Nathan swallowed hard. Edward had gone out of his way to give him this chance, and Nathan wasn't going to waste it. Even if his entire body screamed at him to stop. Even if Mason was determined to break him. Even if he wasn't sure if he could handle it. He was going to keep going. Because for the first time in his life, giving up wasn't an option. The conversation that changed everything. Nathan made it through the day. Barely. By the time he walked through his front door, every muscle in his body protested. He set his toolbox down with a groan and collapsed onto the couch. Lily appeared from the hallway, her face lighting up. Daddy, how was your first day? Nathan let out a breathy laugh. Tough. She climbed onto the couch beside him. But you didn't quit, right? He smiled weakly. No, sweetheart. I didn't quit. Lily beamed. I knew you wouldn't. Nathan chuckled, ruffling her hair. Then, there was a knock at the door. He frowned, pushing himself up. When he opened it, Edward stood there, a small smile on his face. You made it, Edward said simply. Nathan exhaled. Yeah, barely. Edward nodded, as if he already knew. Then he said something that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. Tomorrow's going to be harder. Nathan blinked. Harder. Today was already brutal. Edward smirked. That's the test, son. Day 1. That's just to see if you show up. Nathan frowned. Then what's day 2? Edward's smile faded. Day 2 is when most people quit. Nathan swallowed. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The hardest day yet, The weight of the second day. Nathan woke up before his alarm. Not because he was well rested, because everything hurt. His arms, his back, even muscles he didn't realize existed were screaming in protest. His hands, raw and blistered from gripping hammers and lifting lumber, ached as he flexed his fingers. He let out a groan and rolled onto his side, wincing as his sore muscles protested. How the hell was he supposed to do this again? But then he heard soft footsteps padding toward his room. Lily. He barely had time to sit up before she peeked into the doorway, her small face filled with curiosity. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Nathan forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart. Just sore." She walked over, climbing onto the bed, her little hands reaching for his. She gently poked at the calluses forming on his palms, her brows furrowing. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. Nathan swallowed. "A little." Lily looked at him for a long moment before nodding, as if she had just decided something very important. "You can do it." Nathan blinked. "Do what?" She grinned. "Go back today, even if it's hard." Nathan chuckled despite the pain. This kid. She believed in him with such pure certainty that it made the fear inside him feel stupid. He pulled her into a hug, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're my best cheerleader, you know that." She giggled. "Of course. Now go be amazing." Nathan sighed, standing with a groan. His legs protested as he stretched, his back still sore from the day before. But Lily was right. He had to do this. Back to the grind. By the time Nathan arrived at the worksite, the sun was already beating down on the stacks of lumber and partially built houses. It was hotter today. Worse. Nathan climbed out of his truck, already feeling the sweat forming on the back of his neck. Mason was waiting for him near the supply area, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You came back," Mason said, as if he was genuinely surprised. Nathan rolled his shoulders. "I said I would." Mason studied him for a long moment, then let out a snort. "All right then, rookie. Let's see what you've got." Nathan expected today to be like yesterday. Heavy lifting, endless hammering, brutal physical work. He was wrong. Today was worse. Mason pushed him harder, making him carry double the weight, giving him no breaks, and forcing him to do everything twice as fast. By midday, Nathan was drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to his back, his muscles screaming for relief. But he didn't stop. Even when his arms trembled from exhaustion, even when his legs threatened to give out, even when Mason threw harder and harder tasks his way, Nathan refused to quit. And at some point, he wasn't sure when, he noticed something strange. The other workers had started watching him, not mocking him, not ignoring him, watching, studying him, as if they were waiting to see if he'd breaking through. By the time afternoon hit, Nathan was working on installing part of the framework for a house when he felt something snap in his hand. At first, he thought it was a tool. Then, pain shot up his palm. He looked down. His blister had torn open. Blood welled up, staining his palm, making the hammer slip from his grip. Nathan gritted his teeth, grabbing a rag from his tool belt and pressing it against the wound. Mason, who had been watching from a few feet away, raised an eyebrow. "You gonna cry about it?" Nathan shot him a glare. "No." Mason smirked. "Then keep going." Nathan did. His hand burned with every swing. The fabric of his glove rubbed against the raw skin, making it worse. But he didn't stop. And when they finally finished for the day, Nathan stood back, looking at what they had built. A foundation, a real structure, something he had helped create. He let out a slow breath, feeling something settle inside him. Pride. He had never felt that after a shift at the hardware store. But here, his work meant something. A moment of respect. As the workers began packing up, Mason walked over, arms still crossed. Nathan braced himself for another comment. But instead, Mason did something unexpected. He held out a beer. Nathan blinked. What? Mason smirked. You made it through day 2. That means you earned this. Nathan hesitated. Then, slowly, he took it. The cap was already off, so he took a sip. The cold liquid burned down his throat, but it felt good. Mason let out a chuckle. Most guys quit by lunch on day 2. Thought for sure you'd be one of them. Nathan smirked, disappointed. Mason laughed. Nah, kinda impressed, actually. Nathan let that sink in. He had spent the last 2 days proving himself, and now, he was one of them. Edward's final lesson. That evening, Nathan sat on his porch, exhausted but satisfied. His hands were bandaged, his muscles sore, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Then, as if the universe had planned it, Edward appeared, walking slowly toward Nathan's house. He stopped at the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning Nathan's bruised knuckles. You survived. Nathan smirked. Yeah, barely. Edward chuckled, sitting beside him. So, he said after a moment, you still scared? Nathan thought about that. Yesterday, yes. This morning, yes. But now something had shifted. He wasn't just taking a job. He was becoming something more. He was building a future. For himself. For Lily. For everything he had ever wanted. So he shook his head. No, Nathan said, his voice steady. Not anymore. Edward smiled. Good. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Then, Edward spoke one last time. You did something a lot of men can't do, Nathan. What's that? Edward turned to him, his expression serious. You stopped surviving. Nathan swallowed hard. Then, Edward smiled. And now, you're living. Nathan let the words settle deep in his chest, because for the first time in years, they were true.